Okay, welcome to the casting cave. This is Lee Witcher from ABC, AtlantaBeatsCovid, putting together a video for you today for making N95 mask seals and gaskets. This video is intended to be in conjunction with the presentation slides, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'll firstly give you a quick overview of everything you're going to need to get casting. Here is my casting station, so you need to make it look something a little bit like this. First off, you're going to need, this is parchment paper. You're going to need to cover your area just to protect it with some kind of disposable covering. I like parchment because it's pretty non-stick and it's cheap. And I have two distinct stations set up, one for the do it here first station where I'd actually do some work, or do the trimming, do the mixing, and then a station over here for where you can leave the molds and not have them bumped or anything while they're curing. So the implements we're going to need, here I've got a little piece of, this is acrylic, but this is just a chopping board type item for trimming later. So this could be any form of cutting mat or cutting board, or anything that you've got lying around, scrap wood or whatever. We've got a knife for trimming, nail scissors for trimming, stirring stick. You're obviously going to have like a lot of these, but you could also use a normal metal kitchen knife if you want to use something that's reusable. We have a paper plate here to dump our mixing stick and other dirty things on as we're moving. We have our mixing cup, which is a 16-ounce smooth-on mixing cup. We have some pigment, silicone pigment, Silk Pig from Smoothcast, some mold release, spray mold release, some baby wipes, some paper towels. Then of course we have all of our molds, which we'll go into more detail later. Then we have a trash can. It's always good to be able to put trash straight into a trash can without you kind of turning and dripping it on the floor or whatever. And then finally the rubber itself. So the Moldstar 20T comes in these gallon buckets, which is just a nightmare to pour from. So we have those, and then we also have some sealed bottles to decant into. So we have part A, which is the yellow, and then part B, which is the blue. So I've put a little bit of tape on there so you can tell the difference as this stuff is clear. So once you look roughly like this, you're good to go. Okay, so step one is to prep the molds. Here you can see that we have two sets of molds, where a set is a shell set of 3 and a gasket. So this is basically one mask's worth, and then we have 2 of those. These are completely free of any residual silicone on them, and I'm not going to show that because it's kind of self-explanatory, but after a pour you want to peel off all the silicone, and most of it comes off in one go because it's stuck to itself. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take spray release, give it a shake, and we're going to make sure that everything that silicone's going to touch has a nice coat of spray release on. Actually, silicone doesn't really stick to anything. A lot of the time it doesn't even stick to itself, so this isn't hypercritical. I do it maybe every 6 mold cycles. I guess you could probably get away with up to 10. I just don't tempt fate on that one. So the key for this is to make sure that we coat all surfaces that are going to touch rubber, and you don't want to coat it so it's dripping. You want to have a light spray. So we just kind of go over, give it a light spray. I'm not really sure what mold release is. I'm guessing it's some kind of Let me just turn those around, make sure we get everything. I think it's like silicon particles or something. And then, now this one, this middle inner shell is definitely going to get coated a lot, because all of these surfaces, every single surface on here is going to see it. Now also, you might want to put a little bit of mold release on the surface that you're using if it's something that you want to be able to clean off easily. Because I'm using parchment, I don't care too much. But now we've got to let the mold release kind of dry off for about 5 minutes. So see you then.
5 minutes later.
Now the mold release has gassed off a little bit, we can assemble the molds. Now it's not super critical that you wait 5 minutes. It's not like some astrophysical that means that it's going to break, but it just means that it's going to be less liquidy when you do the pour. And even if you sprayed it and then poured straight away, it would work fine and it would come out fine. It's just the part would have the kind of liquid mold release on it. So it's not super critical, but you know, I like to spray and do something else for a little while, and then I know it's going to be less kind of cleaning afterwards. So here we see the bottom sealed mold and we see the inner sealed mold. Bottom is the male part for obvious reasons, inner is the female part. So there's only one way these can go together, and there we go. Now if you see this groove in here and I pull this out, you'll see there's this feature around here. That creates the kind of flat part that goes up against your face. But if you imagine this mold being together, when that silicon cures under there, it's going to be trapped. And which is why we have this multi-part mold. Not only does it cause it to be trapped, but as you're pouring the rubber in, it can actually lift the inner part, like make it float. So we have this screw to clamp it down. Now these molds aren't the hardest material ever, so you can scratch them real easy. You only need to tighten this up just so it holds, and then we put the outer part on and we're finished. So let's repeat that for mold number 26, which leads me to another point. The molds are numbered not because we're tracking the molds, but because you need to keep the numbers together, because these have been originally molded and now they're sanded, and which means that they're ever so slightly different dimensions, and so you need to make sure that you keep the parts together. And then now we've got all the molds assembled, we want to arrange our molds in the casting configuration, and we'll get into that in the next clip. Now on the seal molds, we have to pour in a particular way. As you can see from the part here, we have this flat panel on the front of the mold, on the seal. Now this is the same part I told you about earlier, that is formed by going under the overhang underneath the inner part. So as you can see in this part, this is a reject part because we have this big air bubble under that overhang, so on the top of this surface. And so what we want to do is pour the material in the back of this mold in this area here, and then allow that material to flood through to the front and burp the mold. And by the time we've gone round and we've come back to that mold again, there's been enough time for the material to flood under that surface and push all the air that's trapped under that surface out. Now when it comes time to finally pour the rubber into the mold, we can't afford any distractions as the rubber's already curing and it's thickening up as it's curing. So this step, the pre-pouring step, is about getting everything ready. The molds are already in the pouring configuration. We have the rubber right next to us. We have our plate here. We have the pigment ready to go, and most important thing, we have our wipes ready for when we spill something, which is inevitable. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to pour one of our doses into the smooth on cup. Let me try and do that left-handed. Okay, so you'll see I've raised the cup up to eye level. That's so I don't get parallax error and I'm too lazy to bend down. Now you can see the stuff is glooping in there. Okay, I'm just going to tilt back up to slow down the pour. You see how viscous it is, that glooping. We really need to sneak up on 125 milliliters because that glooping causes a little bit of time delay in it. So I'm happy with that, 125 mil. And then the final part of this step is to get our pigment ready on our mixing stick. So you saw how I just dipped it in a tiny amount. That is literally enough as a minimum. I'm going to put a little bit more just because I want a deeper color of blue. And then I'm going to sit the stick there on the cup and we are ready to do the final pour. So it's finally time for the pour. I've moved things around a little bit to get things in view and so we can zoom in on the pour a little. Here we go with the other part of the rubber and we're about to drop in another 125 mil and then it's go time. No distractions. Here goes. So it's another 125 milliliter dose, which is going to get us up to 250 mil. Now this stuff starts curing as soon as part A meets part B. It doesn't have to be fully mixed. Whenever one molecule hits another molecule, it is going. So we cannot mess around and we have to mix quickly. Perfect amount left in that. Okay, so pigmented mixing stick going in. We're going to stir pretty vigorously, mostly in one direction. We don't want to fold any air in because that's going to be something else to worry about getting caught in the mold. We've got about 5 to 6 minutes in the cup before it's too thick to pour. Okay, now I'm going to come in and scrape the sides. I'm going to scrape around the corners in the bottom and I'm going to give it one more thorough stir. And then we're going to scoop the stick off, get that on the paper plate, move you guys over here, and here goes. So as I said before, I'm going to pour in the back of the mold. We want to get a pour going and then pull up quite high. We can moderate the thickness of the stream by giving it more distance over which to spread out, which is why we pull the cup up. And as you can see, it doesn't matter if you kind of miss it a little bit, it's going to pull itself down into the mold in that gap. And we're going to just speed up the flow a little by tilting it over, squeezing the cup a little, but just bear in mind as it goes over the lip, it's going to kind of glug out once. So we want to do that in a real controlled way. And we're going to keep doing this on this mold until it feels kind of backed up a little, which there we go. Now on to the second one. Start the pour, pull up high, just pour around the back. Notice how I didn't worry about pouring some rubber on the table between the two molds. That's because rubber just peels off nicely. You can't really go wrong with rubber unless it's in something fibrous like carpet or hair. Don't ask me how I know that. If you do spill a fair amount, just wait 30 minutes for it to cure and then peel it off. Okay, so that's getting pretty backed up, so I'm going to go into the gasket molds. So the gaskets are definitely going to take a little bit of judgment. The seal molds we're deliberately over pouring because we can trim afterwards, but the gaskets, they're an open mold and these are a lot harder to trim. So it's not the end of the world if we go over. You never need to worry about over pouring either of these molds, but you definitely want to try and get it right first time. So over time you'll just get a bit better at noticing how much you've got, and you'll see by the time we get back here that that will have settled out a fair amount. So we'll go back to the first one, and you guys can't see it but I can. It's kind of burped now. That first dose has pushed its way to the kind of the nose end of the mold and burped the overhang at the back. So that's backed up again a little there, so I'm going to come over to number 25. One thing I want to talk about a little bit is what happens if you've spilled a lot. Now obviously you don't want to waste rubber, so you don't want to stop pouring. But let's say you know you've messed up a mold. We want to try and recover what the other molds. So if at this point I feel like I've messed up this mold 25, I know this takes a lot of volume. So if I carry on trying to save it, I'm going to jeopardize saving the other ones. Okay, so looking at the gaskets, that's fine. That's fine. There's a little bit of overpour on each of those, but that's just a little trim. So now we're going to go and finish the first one. Now because it's burped, we can kind of pour everywhere, and I can feel that it's thickening up substantially now. And so we want to make sure we go to a pour all around to make sure that it doesn't thicken up too much before it's everywhere in the mold. Look at that. Oops, missed there. Okay, I'm going around everywhere. Now again, there's not much left in the cup. Keep an eye on what's in the cup. I know this is just enough. Famous last words. So I'm going to carry on, and I'm looking at the other mold now, and I'm constantly judging, have I got enough? Look how thick that is now. It's like a fruit strip. Okay, now on these molds we want to deliberately over pour because we can fix in the trim. Let me put a little bit more on this one. These are designed to be an overflowing pour. So now the rubber's just too thick to pour, so we're done at this point largely. I might be able to get a little bit more into this one, and then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to get our knife, and we're just going to keep an eye on this for a couple of minutes and just pop any big air bubbles. These air bubbles are mostly coming about because of the way we poured these seals at the end there. Going backwards and forwards just gave it the ability to fold back on itself and trap air in there, and it's so viscous now it's really hard for the air to come out. So that's a pour. And now we'll come back in approximately 30 minutes, maybe 40 minutes, and demold and trim.
30 minutes later.
First thing we're going to do is check that the rubber left in the mixing cup is in fact set. So there's no tack to it. We know it's set, so we can just grab a little piece and then pull it all out in one go. Immensely satisfying. If it was mixed well, there's no residue or stickiness left in the cup. In this case, there is no stickiness in the cup, so we're good. Just going to peel off those little bits. So that cup is ready to use again on the next time. And so first off, let's look at the gaskets. So demolding the gaskets, as simple as grabbing a corner, pulling it out, and there you go in its untrimmed state. Same again, pulling it out. So, as you can see, I just pulled up the seal mold, and everything that was kind of stuck from earlier on the parchments just come right up, or come off. And that's the beauty of working with this stuff. So, first thing I like to do is just peel all the kind of big stuff. I wouldn't even mess with those little dribbles, but just the big stuff. And then we're gonna, what you want to do is get your knife blade extended and use the top flat surface of the mold to guide you round the back. This is also immensely satisfying, and we're going to keep some pressure on to keep that knife along the surface. I just caught the nut there, so I went back and let it go. And we're just going to put a little bit of light downward pressure on there to make sure that we dig right in, and then peel that off. So now I'm going to have a quick check around and see that it's flush everywhere. It is indeed flush. And so we can remove the nut properly this time. Drop the screw out. And the first thing we do here is I'm going to break that. We're going to pull the top and the bottom apart, and this is simply a case of just putting some pressure there, pulling some pressure. Now you see the inside face of the mold, and you can see where, like this thin flashing here, where it's seeped underneath the inner part. And then we're going to turn it around so the top is facing us, and we're going to use our two thumbs to push the middle part through. And now you'll see the kind of final untrimmed seal. And you can peel like the big bits off, but do not pull off too many of these big flashings, otherwise you will pull chunks out of the side of the seals. And also you might be tempted to trim it now, you might be tempted to run an X-Acto knife around here now, but do not do that. You will dig in and slice the seal at some point. So here we go, as simple as that. Now this is technically part of the trimming process, the next step, but we're going to do a quick check now to look for that air bubble I showed you earlier. No huge air bubbles under there. So this is not an instant reject. Now there are some smaller air bubbles throughout. There's not really much we can do about those smaller air bubbles, and they're inside the mold, the vast majority of them, so they're not going to cause us any problems. So that is one done, and then we'll quickly do the other one too. That was waste. Just going to go straight in for the trim this time, working that knife down to the top surface of the mold, twisting it round, And there we go, straight in the trash can. So I'm just gonna, before I demold this, I'm just gonna check, because I know I didn't feel it completely flat down to the surface. So I'm gonna go back and kind of do a trim there. I flattened it out mostly, and then get rid of this screw. Pull these apart. Whoops, don't know if you saw that, went down the back of the table. Pushing through with a thumb. Releasing the seal. Another quick check, no huge air bubbles under there, so there's one suspect one there, a little bigger than I'd like. There's not much we can do about that, so there you go, ready to trim. So let's have a look at trimming the gasket. It's pretty self-explanatory. You know that what the mold looks like. This is a simple 2D profile with a little bit of thickness, so any overpour just needs to be trimmed off. In the case of this one, some thin overpour all around here, and then on the inside too. So we're just going to simply take the X-Acto knife and we're going to go around, and being careful not to go into the gasket itself. We're just going to trim up around it, and I like to kind of not try and do the whole thing in one go, but just do little sweeps and then peel a bit off and go again. If you come up with any better techniques, that is absolutely fine, and I would love to hear your tips and tricks. I am merely, and this is the case with all these videos, just trying to give a kind of introduction into the way I do it and the way I've found after weeks of trial and lots of error. Now, these parts have to sit inside, the gasket has to sit inside the outer shell of the mold. So the outer profile is the more important one. So we really want to make sure that we're cutting off any little pieces that are going to stop it fitting in that mold. The inner edge is it doesn't collide with anything, so we can be a little looser on the inner edge, but you know, in reality there's no reason why we can't trim this right up to the thick 2D profile. So see, it likes to raise up a little bit there sometimes, so another reason for only doing small cut sections at a time. I like to do one kind of general cut to get it close, and then come back for a trim. As my video cut out a little there, sorry about that. So what I was just going to say was, for coming back and doing like the small details, scissors, which I primarily use for the seals themselves, are a good way to get some little features sometimes. So you can just come back and just make little trims, and because the scissors are curved away from what you're cutting, it's a lot harder to cut into the part. And I think the last little bit I'm going to do is that tiny bit of flashing on the inside there, and there's a little bit there. Hope you're in frame. And there we go. Before, after. And obviously there's a way to avoid all trimming, and that is to make sure we never overfill this mold. I'd like to say that that is possible. It is possible technically, it's just highly unlikely. You saw from the pouring section that even me, who's done it a ton of times, you're going to have an overpour, you're going to spill over the sides, and then also I just poured too much in the mold and it overflowed. That's why there's so much trimming. So if you want to pour a little less into the mold to start with, and then sneak up on it, then by all means do that. Another thing you want to do is not pour these with the same batch as the seals and do them separately. Option. Right, onto the seal itself then. So there's three key areas that we care about here. There's this seam along here, along the outside. That is where material has crept underneath the mold because we don't weigh down or strap down the outer part of the mold, which you could do if you want to. I've found that nothing stops this happening, so I don't stress too much. And then there's this inner face where material has leaked underneath the inner part of the mold. So with these, it's just a case of trimming off that excess without cutting into the rubber. Now, and then the final part we care about, or feature we care about, is this back surface here that should have been cut very flat with the knife when we demolded. So the reason we care about this surface is because this is the inner shell for the mask that the rubber goes into. Force it in there and you force it all around and into that groove. If there is any oddness on the back of here, then that's going to jeopardize that fit. So on this one, this was the second one I poured, and when I cut it, sorry, the second one I demolded, and when I cut it, I knew that area around here was not quite flat. So I'm just going to go back and trim that and trim that there. Okay. And there's also a little bit of excess over here. So there you go. And now we're going to look at how to deflash. Unfortunately, I haven't found any good way to deflash apart from to just go at it by hand with scissors. And it's obviously not an ideal thing to have to do, but you know, if doing it with an X-Acto knife, I found that there's no way you can do it without slicing in and making hairline slices into the rubber. So it's not too bad when you get the hang of it. I'm holding the curve away from the part, and so the back side of the curve I'm holding on the part itself and just making short movements and trimming. It's getting a bit long, so I'm just going to trim there and go back. And I'm not worrying too much about getting it super close because we'll go back and trim. Notice how I'm using my inside to make it bow out a little. Okay, excuse the weird angle with the tripod in the way, but it's the only way I can see and have you guys see. So to do the inner flashing takeoff, we are going to bring back the little cutting board and we're going to lay it down and cut the vast majority off in this orientation. So for this, what we're going to use is that thick wall there is going to serve as a knife guide. So we're going to run using that wall to help guide the blade. And just do the pieces that kind of make sense with a little rotation where required. And then just really make sure you hold the knife vertical so that you don't puncture or slice into the seal itself. And occasionally you'll need to just put a little bit of resistance onto the inner seal. So as you can see, that's cut most of it off. You're going to be very tempted at times to, like that piece there, to pull that off of your fingers, but that will take a chunk out of the part for sure. So now we're going to bring the nail scissors in, and just like we did with the knife a second ago, we're actually going to use, apart from this little bit here, actually we'll come back to that, we're actually going to use the wall, that thickness of the wall, to guide the scissors around there, and just go around and take off those little bits that were missed in the knife process. Being careful not to nick into the side. I actually did ever so slightly nick into the side there, but it's not so bad that that's a reject. Be super careful on that bit because it's such a tight little corner. And then just go down and get rid of all those little bits. I stopped cutting that because I knew I was going to probably cut into the part. Being super careful not to cut into the part now, as I'm going with the curve. Very light trims, sorry, I keep taking you out of frame. I am no videographer, I am no YouTube influencer. Okay, I think that might be the last little corner. Just a couple little bits on this edge. With those gone, there you go. It's pretty much a seal, a trimmed seal. So there you go. One thing I want to show you is, remember when I tried to twist that nut out, it took a big old chunk out of the part. So that is a reject, and so definitely trim the excess off before you try and take the nut off, and I'll go back and put a note on that. So I'm probably boring you now, but definitely look for rejects, big rejects on parts before you spend the time trimming. Otherwise, just you're wasting your time trimming. This one would have probably been rejected anyway because of those huge air bubbles there. And air bubbles mean, well, firstly, these are not just bubbles, these are bubbles that have popped and are on the surface. So these are ones that I didn't catch when I was popping them with a knife. They must have come up after. And so those are just little nooks and crannies for liquids to hide in. And especially in a time of COVID, we do not want anything hiding in nooks and crannies. So that's a reject, but we don't throw away rejects. We keep them just in case we want to do something funky with them later. So once you're done, once you've identified a reject, put it in its own separate bag. There you go, that's trimming.